So this begins the seventh part of our series regarding equine pasture management. We're going to be covering winter lull today. Over the previous six series, we talked about establishing and surviving all different aspects of Mother Nature throughout the year and trying to maximize the production out of our pastures and getting most out of our forages and helping determine which goals you have for your pasture and then trying to meet those goals. So the final part is trying to survive the winter aspect of it. As we go through this presentation, you'll kind of see what pitfalls that we see throughout the year for winter lull, and then how we can try to mitigate those factors with some management skills. So one of the biggest aspects is we've just hopefully got done doing a little bit of fall reseeding. Now this year was once again trending a little bit towards like we had in previous fall, where we had an extreme drought. And luckily we didn't go to near the depths that we did. But in this one, we had slightly warmer temperatures, mid 80s to 90s. And then we had an extended period of drought, which really kind of hampered some of our reseeding. And so in this picture, you'll see that we have a nice crop of grass getting ready to pop up. This was done through a seeder, as you can see, the drill lines and the grass growing right there in straight rows. And we'll talk a little bit later how that grass will try to fill in. But this was done with a drill rather than broadcast seeding. But as you can see, really nice stand of grass popping up right there. That's perfectly what we're looking for through a fall reseeding. And now our key is to try to manage this type of field through the winter. So when we try to look around, what's around the corner, and this was about this time, we talk about in October, that we start to see what's around the corner. And one of the best ways that we talked about earlier in the year to evaluate your lawn, or in the case that we're talking about, our equine pastures, is right after that first heavy frost. Now, the bad part about evaluating your pasture after the first heavy frost is you really don't have any time to really adjust it during that really peak time of the fall reseeding. So when we see that first frost, we typically are not going to have a lot of warm temperatures right after that. If we are fortunate enough to have an extended period of warm weather coming up, maybe we can start to do some work, but most likely we're not going to. But in this picture, you can see in the immediate forefront of the picture, we have all this brown grass in here. And in the very background, you can see that nice house that has all that nice green yard in there. So more than likely this house in the front, they had some summer grasses, some are perennial, some are annuals like crabgrass, perennial like Bermuda grass. And as the nighttime temperatures started getting much colder, it started turning brown. And then when you get that first frost, it really kind of ends it, especially for those annuals. They'll turn brown awful sudden. And so what you have left typically is our cool season perennial grasses. We're not going to see a whole bunch of winter weeds or some of our springtime cool season weeds starting to pop up yet. So this is kind of a real peak time to be able to evaluate what kind of stand do you have. Because when you first walk out during the middle of summer or early fall, it can get kind of confusing to see all the different grasses that are out there. They're all green. And so you're not really sure if you have a cool season fescue growing or if you have some Bermuda or if you have some perennial or annuals out there. Once we get that first frost, you can really start to evaluate what kind of stand you have of your cool season fescue or your orchard grass and go from there. So like I said, the bad part is there's not a lot of time to do anything here, so we can prepare at least towards next fall, or in the case that you're really desperate to do something, you can look towards this spring. So when we look at it, just kind of refreshing a little bit, but it's something that we need to keep in the back of our mind. When we look at these, if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see a fescue pasture. It's not quite the bright green that we'll see in early spring or right and towards the fall right now that we're seeing, where it's kind of freshening up a little bit. The heat's dissipated. It's getting some cooler nights, some rain. And so this is a grass that's kind of sitting here through the wintertime. Not the brilliant green, but it's still green. The one on the right would be an example of like a Bermuda grass, a summer perennial grass or a summer grass. it is nearly all brown. You're not going to see really any green in a Bermuda grass. It's kind of lying there dormant, just trying to survive. So that what I want to really take from this slide is, don't take the fact that this is green and this is brown, that this is the green one is in active growth, or the fescue is in active growth. The weather, the time of daylight has really put this in a dormant period. It's just able to maintain the green because it's more of a cool season grass. It's designed for that. But don't mistake the fact that it's green, that it is still in really active growth. So it's not as easy to recover from injury or stress or anything like that because it's green and this one's brown. They're both in a period of dormancy. So as we start to look at it, if you did do some reseeding this fall, you're starting to look at the picture on the left, which is some brand new seedlings starting to pop up. And you walk out there and they're just the most innocent little seedlings you're going to see. They're hanging on literally by a thread in the ground. What you see on the outside is about a quarter of an inch of root below. And so they truly are very delicate creatures. And when I say time is of the essence, any type of damage, impact, walking on, or anything like that you're going to see on this grass, you're liable to, like I said, if you scuff your foot along there, you're going to rip up all these seedlings. So when we look at it, why we recommend planting in the fall is that, in theory, you're going to get multiple rainy seasons on there. You're going to kind of get the fall, winter rainy season on there, and then hopefully that late winter, early spring rainy season on there. So this grass, is one little seedling, is going to have time to get plenty of rain to get enough growth. And then if you look at it, our grasses don't typically grow in one little blade groups like this. Now they grow what we call clumps. So this one little blade is going to clump out and create a clump. And then that's how your yard or your pasture begins to fill in. Just like if you drilled it, if you come back a few years later, it doesn't look like you just drilled the pasture straight down the line. Each one of those little blades of grass has started to clump out. And once it gets to its mature clump, that's as big as it's going to get. It's not going to continue to spread like we talked about with our Bermuda grass. So, but in order for this little blade of grass to clump out like the picture you see on the right, that's going to take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to get completely to that size. But we're not going to see that clumping like these individual blades. We're not going to see those clumpings if we plant them in the fall till mid to late spring. So the very earliest, you're looking at 6 months, but we're looking at probably 2 years to try to get this big clump of grass. So once again, we're going to talking about the timeline again, and that's for the purpose of when we talk about this winter. So I want to give you kind of background on all the things that we're going to talk about regarding the winter lull, on where our grasses are at and what it's going to take to get them to that next stage, or to get them to this 6 month stage. Because it is in a very delicate position at this time. So when we look at it, I'm guessing quite a few of us can relate to the picture that we're looking at, and it's just a really muddy pasture. We see some grass in there, but once again, just because it's green doesn't mean it's in active growth. So what we have here is grass that has been cut down very short, been grazed very short. And then we have the rainy seasons of the fall, winter, and spring, and we get a lot of freezing and thawing. And so what it does is it just creates a surface that becomes then very muddy. We don't have the deep root system because the grasses are not actively growing. And so we don't have a lot of that erosion control. So what we get is a very muddy lot. And this is exactly what happens to most of our pastures, where we have a lot of activity, whether it's horses, cattle, or anything like that. During the winter. And so our key is how can we mitigate this, and how can we keep our pastures from starting to look like this? Because not only does this create a problem for the current time, but we're going to feel the effects in our pasture from here on out, where each one of these spots where we continue to erode and lose our grass stand, that we're going to fill that in with weeds and other things. So when we start talking about the effects of winter on the pasture, there's just numerous effects. We talk about impaction, okay, because the ground is a little bit softer and then it freezes and thaws. And so we don't have the active growth. We don't have that cushion between the ground, the soil, and the grass plant. So what happens with the key about impaction is when our grasses are growing, we talk about the nutrients getting in the ground, okay, and the ability of the roots to spread out throughout the ground to pick up different nutrients. When we get impaction, those roots can't spread out. We don't get air, we don't get nutrients leaching into the ground because it's not able to. Instead of leaching into the ground, it actually runs off the surface. And then our roots can't spread out near as much. And so, when it comes to impaction like that, if we've got a extended period of drought, the roots can only survive with the water that they have in their little area. If there's not compaction, they can spread out a little bit further to try to find additional water sources. But with impaction, they're only able to search for water within that tight area that they're bound to. So impaction is a big component of our pastures that we sometimes don't think about. Of course, you're going to get into erosion when you don't have a really thick grass stand, good root system. You're going to start to see erosion where water is going to run off and start to create different ditches and runoff areas right through our pastures. You're going to get a loss of stand. We talked about in the previous picture where we started to have muddy areas. Anywhere where our horses are running and sliding and ripping up grass, that's going to be replaced by not grass in the spring or fall. It's going to be replaced by weeds if we don't do anything about it. Just like we're going to have weed pressure, any one of those open areas is going to be a spot prime for having weed pressure starting to pop up, further depleting our nutrients that our grasses are trying to get. If you've got a really muddy lot, you're going to have increased energy use, so that's going to be increased feed. You're going to have to feed your horse. Not only are they trying to maintain it through the winter, and then if they're doing any type of exercise, you're going to have another energy use. But now they're going to be working the entire time they're in the lot. So you've got increase in energy use, and they're further depleting their energy stores. Quite frankly, you just have a waste of money. When you look at any type of renovation you're doing on any of your pastures, it can be completely lost when you don't give it a proper amount of time and give your pastures proper attention during the winter. So you could do all the things right for 9 months of the year and have it all reversed in a quick 3 months and be a complete waste of money. And quite frankly, it's just frustrating, whether you're the horse or the owner, having to walk through mud every day, having to clean up your horses because they are muddy, having to deal with erosion areas, having to deal with just the appearance, the mud, and then just the wasted pasture that comes with lack of management during the winter. So what we look at our options. So the key is, we look at this nice, big, beautiful pasture. It's got beautiful green grass, and the question is, can we improve our pastures in the winter? When we talk about can we improve our pastures, can we increase the stand? Can we manage weeds? Can we do some of those? No, not necessarily. Not for the most part. We can't do it at this time. But what we can do is manage all the negative factors that are coming with it. And so a lot of times those negative factors can outweigh some of the positive things that we can do. So rather than adding, we're looking at trying to reduce the deductions that we take, whether it's deduction from destruction of the land, the erosion appearance, or whatever that may be. So we actually are improving our pastures by managing them during the winter. So what we're going to try to do is just kind of go through a series of steps that you can do. Steps kind of go up in difficulty. And step one, so if you do any of the steps, it is an improvement. So if you do the series of steps, obviously it's going to be better. Each step you go further up, it's going to equal better results on your pasture. But if you can at least do one or two of the steps along the way, that's at least going to be a positive step or a positive move forward in maintaining your pasture. So in step one, it may just involve spreading your hay around. So a lot of times we'll have either a hay ring out in our pasture, and we put our either round bale or square bales, and we put that hay at the same place every day. And then our horses continue to wear down that area. As you can see in picture on the left, they throw the hay bale out there. Of course, this is what happens when you don't put a hay ring around there. Oftentimes this becomes a really nice bed for a lot of these horses. But you continue to put the hay in the same spot, and we continue to see a buildup of manure. We're going to see a buildup of wastage of this hay around here. And so when we look at the following spring, we're not going to have grass that's going to pop up and grow here. So we have basically this entire area that surrounds this hay bale or hay ring is going to pop up in weeds the next year because there's not going to be any grass. And if you were to want to reseed it in the spring, you'd have to dig all of this hay and manure wastage out because you have too high of a concentration of decaying material, and your grass just will not grow if you tried to seed some grass in here. So you'd have to physically come out here, dig all this stuff out, and you could go spread it, or you could do a compost pile, which would be more desirable. So what we can do, and then the same thing goes for the way we feed hay. If you're feeding like little flakes of hay, a lot of us may have a little feeding area in the winter. It's cold, it's wet, it's rainy. You don't want to go out in the field. So what do? You kind of feed them right there, that fence line right there near the barn or right there near the house. And we feed them in the same spot every day because we don't want to get out in the cold weather. Well, what happens is, once again, we get the same effect from the round bale or whatever that we're doing out in the field, is that we move, we just keep a high concentration of manure and hay in that same area. They wear out the grass that is in that area. So pretty soon we have, once again, bare spots, mud, erosion, all in that area. So the very least what you can do in the situation, if you're going to be feeding in your pasture, move your hay rings around each time, move your feeding areas around each time, and this will spread out and reduce the amount of impaction and erosion that we see on any one spot. Step two, if you're wanting to take it to the next level, we can start talking about doing some rotational grazing. We talked about all the benefits from that from our previous series on pasture management, all the benefits that we get from rotating, but it also goes through winter too. So if you were to have rotational grazing, what you could do is what we call sacrifice one of your lots, because the reason why a lot of us like to use our pastures, some of us think that we still get some grazing nutrients out of it, and we really don't. It's more of a habit or just a genetic ability that they're genetically going to try to graze, but they're not really getting anything out of it. And others like to look at it as a form of exercise, which is considered both reasonable. But what you can do, so they're wanting to have that space in their pasture at any time. Well, when you talk about doing rotational grazing, if we were just to go ahead and open this up and let our horses just roam around, we feed them round bales wherever, then our entire pasture can't be renovated, okay? And two, they're going to destroy the entire area. So what we can do, if we do rotational grazing and you still want to do some refurbishment, reseeding, maintenance of some of these pastures, is you pick one pasture and you decide for the winter, for this winter and this year, I'm going to sacrifice one section. You pick that section, and that is where you're going to do all your feeding. Your horses, when they go out to graze or when they go out for some exercise, they go out to the same section every time. When you feed them round bales, they go out, or hay bales, square bales, they go out to the same section every time. That then allows you to maintain these other 6 or 7 sections. So you could do some reseeding in the fall. And what the key is that you're allowing them to sit there and grow without any damage and impaction throughout the fall, winter, and early spring. Okay, because we always talk about, that's the key, is they need about 6 months or 5 months of time to actually get growth and get establishment. So when the horses go out there and walk on them, eat them, they don't pull up the individual plants. So by sacrificing this one lot, we allow these other lots to be maintained. We can refurbish them, maintenance, and put some maintenance into them. And then maybe the following year, we go back through there and do some work on the previous year's sacrifice lot, and we sacrifice one of these other lots. And so we'll eventually be able to redo most of these lots throughout, and we'll just keep cycling through it. Now, if you want to continue to use that lot as your sacrifice lot, you're more than welcome. Or if you've got 3 or 4 that you really like as pastures and you don't ever want to use them as a sacrifice lot, that's that'd be perfectly understandable as well. But sacrificing at least one of these and then allowing the others to sit dormant will allow these others to survive. So what you're doing is you're sacrificing one of them for the good and betterment of the overall project. You are going to reduce your overall impact, but what you really have is on the downside is you're going to have some increased management of trying to rotate these pastures and trying to figure out which one's going to be your sacrifice. And it's not going to be a pleasant looking pasture because they are on it during the winter and they are on a concentrated amount of time. But this will help you maintain your other pastures during that time when we talk about the 6 months of rest. So we get into step 3. Step 3 is adding a dry lot. When we talk about dry lot, we're talking about a mud lot, and we like to call it a dry lot, but during the best of times it's a dry lot, and during the worst it's a mud lot. But the whole purpose of this product or this type of management is it pulls them off of our pastures. And so when we typically are feeding during the winter, for most of us, we're feeding hay during that time. And so we feed at the same spot every day during the winter. Oftentimes we're feeding them in the barn. And so rather than them having a pasture to wear and tear, we pull them off our pastures and we feed them in the same spot in this little area around the barn. And it reduces the wear on our pasture, so we're not really sacrificing any of them. Now, you can still sacrifice one if you're really determined and you want to still have your rotational grazing, but you still want to have an exercise lot. You can still sacrifice one of your lots, but you really don't need as much space as you probably think you do regarding running around, because they're probably not going to be running around to a high degree. So your exercise lot may not need to be as large as you think it should be. But what it does is reduce pasture wear. We are able to concentrate our feeding in one of these areas instead of spreading it out all over our field. With a dry lot becomes the increased mud and wear. They're not necessarily that appealing to look at when they're not dry, when they're muddy. And what do we have most of the time during late fall, winter, and early spring? We're getting lots of rain. The ground is freezing and thawing, so lots of moisture is in there. And so there's just no way to make it look very nice when you're talking about mud. Like I said, when it's dry, it looks great and it works great, but during the muddy time. But the overall point of this is we have one concentrated feeding area. While we're feeding hay anyway, they're not getting anything off of the pasture from a nutrition point of stand, and you're keeping them from wearing and tearing on the grass, because when they go out in the grass, they may run around, or every time they take a step, it's impacting and they're sliding because it's wet and it's ripping up the grass. So it's doing a lot of damage at that time. And step 4, this is one of the most important steps I think you can have. I think this is a tool that a lot of us don't realize the importance and the value of it. And that's having a heavy use area. You can look at the top and the bottom. These are 2 different areas that have been created as a heavy use area. We talk about them being all the deposits that come from them. They're permeable. And what you're seeing here is actually, it's like almost like a concrete-like surface, but it does drain. And so that's a good point. You're not putting them on concrete. It's much softer, but it is permeable as well. So obviously the appearance has been improved quite a bit versus the mud lot. We just don't see that. It's healthier. Anytime you have mud, you have manure, you have hay getting broken down. So you're getting a lot of infestation of insects, disease, and it's just not very sanitary. You're going to reduce frustration and waste. And not just necessarily frustration and waste on the horse's part when it comes to wasted energy and frustration of walking through the mud. But I promise you, if every day you had to walk through the mud to feed your horses, it would get very frustrating on your part. And sometimes we don't think about that. And we're like, well, I could deal with a little mud today. And when you talk about doing it on a daily basis, it becomes very frustrating. And you get very frustrated for your horse as well. We see reduced pasture destruction. Okay, we can concentrate them on this area since we are feeding them and they're just eating hay most of the day. We can reduce the destruction on our pasture and reduce the destruction on our overall property as far as appearance-wise. The downfall, of course, to managing something like this is that you've got the initial cost of building it and then just the upkeep and cost of maintaining it. And it's not as bad as other things as far as in our operation, but there is certainly a cost to it. But you can definitely see right here in this bottom picture, we talk about even feeding hay, even in this hay saver, it is falling out. But the key is, we talked about in the field, you have to go out there if you want to grow grass out there, because if you don't, you're going to have a big weed patch here. But if you want to grow grass out in your hay field, you're going to have to come through here and dig all this up to get all this waste out of there so that you can reseed it. Here, you can look at it. It's real easy. You just go along here, you scrape the top of it, and you can put it in your compost pile, and then you can put your hay bale right back there again. So you're able to utilize that same spot. And so that means that you don't have to have near as much space for your heavy use area as you would maybe a dry lot, because each one of those areas is going to be mud, pile up mud. So you're going to move it to another area, maybe a little drier spot. And so eventually your whole lot is kind of a disaster. But here you can have a much smaller space and be able to clean it up and improve it quite a bit. And so we're going to spend next slide. We're going to take a little time just to learn how we make it. There's a lot of people that are capable of making this on the commercial side or for hire. But if you've got a few of the tools, you can also do this yourself. It's a pretty simple system, and the return on it is immense, as far as not just your pastures, but your just daily life of walking around, and for your horses being on that, as well as you. It makes life much, much simpler for you. So the key is digging to your existing hard pan or clay. And so what happens is you need to dig down until you hit a hard surface. It could be a good hard clay surface where it doesn't easily dig up. It could be a hard rock surface, whatever that may be. And then you're going to lay a geotextile cloth. And so what this cloth does, this is the biggest key. This cloth allows water and everything to permeate through the cloth, make it down its way down through the different layers, permeate the cloth, head into the soil. But what it prevents is, when you start to pile your other materials on top of this rock, it prevents it from working further down into the soil. And so that's why we got back into digging down to get hard pan or clay. So you want the geotextile to sit on a hard surface. If it's sitting on very loose soil, it's not going to keep its shape. It's going to form to the shape of the soil. And so when you start to add your rock over time, it's going to start working its way, and it's not going to keep a nice, flat, hard surface. And so that geotextile cloth then holds that rock in place. If you just look at pouring rock, any of you that have poured rock on top of mud to slow a wash area or to make a little heavy use area, traffic area as you go between two gates, if you don't put a material down, that rock is on top for the first month, and then as it rains or gets muddy, it starts to work its way down into the soil, and pretty soon you're left with a mud hole again. So the key in any of those things, we are making a heavy use area for your horses, or a heavy or a high traffic area between gates, is get that geotextile cloth down on a hard surface. And then we're going to come in with 3 to 6 inches of coarse rock, some gravel, driveway rock, and we're going to have about 3 to 6 inches of that. And a lot of it depends on how far you have to go down to hit your hard pan for your geotextile. But roughly it's going to come in this area about 3 to 6 inches of coarse rock. And then on top of that is we're going to bring in our 2 to 3 inches of limestone. The reason I mentioned limestone, there's a few other materials that you can put on there. Sand is one of them. But limestone kind of forms that concrete-like surface, but it's still got enough cushion and give to it. But it allows your horses to be on it. It allows that water to permeate. But then you can easily come through and clean up different materials right off of it and still maintain that the integrity of that really good surface. So when you're looking at doing something like this, you're probably talking anywhere in the 95 cents to $1.30 per square foot to actually create this. And of course, that's all variable depending on how much time and labor you're going to put into it yourself. But there is maintenance. You are going to be continuing to add limestone, and eventually you may have to replace your geotextile cloth over time. But the overall benefits that come from having a heavy use area are immense. And like I said, you can create as large as you want, but it really doesn't need to be that large. Anywhere where you've got concentrated feeding, where you're just feeding the horses, it makes it easier for them not to be standing in mud every day that they're eating. And the important part is you don't have to be walking through mud as well. But in the end, this is one of the best management programs that we can have for feeding the horses during the winter, but also allowing our pastures to survive throughout that winter time, which is the key to maintaining a pasture for the overall year, because we could put in all that work throughout the entire year and still not have the desired pasture that we want. So kind of our final thoughts, and this is what we talk about from the very beginning in session 1, is you have to identify your personal and farm goals. I go out and we talk with everybody, and you can have 10 horses on 5 acres, and you can make that work if you understand what your goal of your pasture or your farm or your pasture actually is. If you said, I wanted to get 10 horses on 5 acres and I want to be able to pull forage off of it so I don't have to feed hay, well, that's not a reasonable goal. And so that doesn't mean that we can't work on a goal that is reasonable for your farm. We just have to work on one that's actually going to be doable. And so first, I need to identify the personal or farm goals. What do you want out of your pasture? What do you want out of your farm? And then you can speak with Extension or other entities along the way, and we can try to work through on some plans on if your goals are achievable as they stand, or if we need to tweak them to fit more of what you're actually wanting. Do you want to get more nutrition out of your pasture, or do you want it to be more of an exercise lot? So we just have to figure out where that middle ground is and where you really want to go. And then we develop a plan. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a plan that you originally thought of, but it could be a plan that meets the needs of your farm. And in the end, that's what it has to do. You don't want somebody else to convince you what you need to do. They can tell you what's not feasible, but you want to, in the end, make sure you're comfortable with the plan that's being developed. And then the hardest part in the end is stick to the plan. So when you talk about one of the 4 steps that we talked about, whether it's just having a dry lot or just moving your hay, stick to that plan and don't deviate through the winter. Because once you could stick to it for 11 months and you deviate for 1 month and you've ruined 11 months worth of work. So whenever you come up with your plan, stick to it. And when you want to look at your plan and alter your plan, come back and talk to somebody, see what are some options. But when you come up with a plan, try to stick with it for a year or so. So that concludes our last of our pasture management series. We'll look at coming back in the spring and trying to go through some new things to be looking at. But I encourage you to go out, evaluate your pastures as we start to see our first frost. Evaluate your pastures, see what you have, and then start to evaluate different ways that you can help manage your farm through the winter, whether it's just alternating your feeding areas versus, and then all the way to creating a heavy use area, which is one of the most underrated tools that we do have. So I appreciate everybody and hope everybody has a good winter, and we will talk to everybody when it's a warmer time of year in the spring.